Remember the character of Phil Connors, the self-centered weatherman played by Bill Murray in the movie Groundhog Day. You might be surprised that besides being considered probably one of the funniest movies in Hollywood, it also has been considered probably one of the most spiritual of Hollywood movies. If you remember, Bill Murray played a self-absorbed, arrogant, narcissistic weatherman who's trapped in a time loop, and he's forced to live Groundhog Day over and over and over again. At first, he does this recklessly, passing the endless identical days with drunken binges and reckless driving adventures and one-night stands. And he blames all of his problems on other people. But as time goes by, he's forced to re-examine his life and his priorities. And he comes to the awareness that he's stuck. He gets to a point where he realizes that it's his ego and his cynicism and his selfishness that have been his own undoing. So after a lifetime of self-absorption, he begins to address the needs of others when a homeless man dies, despite his best efforts to save him. He then begins to avert disasters that he used to stand by and watch many times before. He befriends the townspeople that he once shunned. With the benefit of his unique hindsight, he helps some of them through personal crises and steers others towards better decisions. He found a way to get unstuck. The rich man in the gospel that was just proclaimed was stuck. He dined sumptuously every day. He dressed in the finest of clothing. But just like Philip Connors, every day his routine was to walk by that poor man lying at his doorstep covered with sores. And he repeated it over and over and over again, never really seeing him. He was complacent, self-absorbed, caught up in his own mundane existence and routine. He was stuck. The great scripture scholar William Barclay titled this passage, "The Punishment of the Man Who Never Noticed." Now, Phil Connors realized he was stuck, that he created his own problems. The rich man made no such realization until it was way too late. So the gospel this weekend is not a condemnation of wealth. It's not a sin that dives. The rich man was wealthy. His sin was one of neglect, of not noticing, of not seeing what other people were going through. The point Jesus makes is that we do not need to be actively evil or deliberately devilish to miss the gate of heaven. We only need to be inactively indifferent and thoughtlessly selfish, to go our own contented way and step over the beggars on the doorsteps of our lives, unconcerned about their condition and untroubled about their need. The rich man in our gospel did not end up outside of heaven because he was wealthy, but because he neglected. Complacency, neglect, self-absorption are the themes of so much of our literature and movies. The great Tolstoy uses a story in that memorable piece of his, The Death of Ivan Illich. He makes the same point. You see, Ivan Illich is a mean-spirited bureaucrat who he develops abdominal cancer. And he suffers extraordinary pain, and his anguish continues relentlessly until shortly before his death. In the last few hours of his life, he comes upon a stunning truth, that he's dying badly because he lived badly. So in the few days remaining to him, he undergoes a dramatic transformation. And this is rather difficult to describe in any other terms but personal growth. In the last few days of his life, he begins to relate empathically with others. And his chronic bitterness, his chronic arrogance, his chronic self-aggrandizement disappear. In short, in the last few days of his life, he achieves a far higher level of integration than he ever experienced previously. Phil Connors became unstuck early enough in life to truly change how he would live. Ivan Illich, moments before he died, realized that he had wasted his life, but at least he got unstuck for a few moments. The rich man in our gospel never really got it. He lived a so what life, a so what attitude about the needs of other people, until he finds himself without heaven, realizing that it was his life of neglect that caused him an eternity without God. So let's be clear, Jesus isn't condemning wealth or praising poverty. Jesus is challenging you and me as to how we are living our lives right now in the present moment. So let us reflect this evening. Let us ask ourselves a few questions. Who are the Lazaruses lying at my front door? In what ways might I be neglectful? In what ways might I have a so what attitude about the needs of others? In what ways do I live a life of complacency? How often do I take the time to notice the people around me, their needs and their concerns? Not just the homeless people asking for handouts all around our city streets, but the lonely teenager who lives down the street, or the young mother trying to keep her family together after her husband abandoned her. Or how often do we notice the elderly person who no one visits, or the jobless guy who is left behind by a culture that no longer values his skills? Or how often do I notice the person just sitting near me in the congregation who has just received a devastating report from the doctor? And what about our families? What about your wives or husbands, parents or children? And then, do I neglect my own personal health, my own physical health, by my bad habits? And at this time of the year, I think we have to ask ourselves, what about my responsibilities as a citizen of this country? Do I vote? Do I take the time to not just believe the sound bites I hear from talk radio or political ads, but do I take the time to really search out the truth of what's behind what the politicians are telling us? There are so many ways that each one of us can be neglectful. It's very easy to live a so what life of complacency. We are all very much aware of the complex issues of our world and our nation and our own community. I mean, the poverty and violence right here in our own city is overwhelming, not to mention the travesties that have happened this week in our nation, the travesties we see around the world in Syria or Africa. Wouldn't we love to tune it all out? Because it all seems so extremely overwhelming and stressful. And we certainly don't have the ability as individuals or even as a community ourselves to solve all these horrific issues. But Jesus challenges each one of us today not to live a so what complacent kind of existence. He challenges each one of us that each one of us can make some kind of contribution. Each one of us can do something to make the world a better place, our community a better place, our parish a better place. So I think the gospel challenges each of us to ask ourselves the question, who are those who are lying at my doorstep covered with sores? It might simply be my next door neighbor.